My family took a secret vote on Thanksgiving to erase me. What I did next left them speechless. They invited her to Thanksgiving dinner as a final act of politeness. She brought a homemade apple pie, unknowing that what awaited her was a verdict long prepared. When her sister stood up and said, "We took a vote. You're no longer part of this family," the room fell silent. No one stood up for her. No one spoke her name. But what they didn't know was that truth no longer belonged to those who held the right to vote. And for the first time, she chose not to leave quietly. Julia received the email from her sister on a Wednesday afternoon, just after finishing grading the last of her 11th graders' final exams. The subject line was in all caps: Thanksgiving, family gathering. It came with a PDF attachment decorated with pumpkins, turkeys, and fall leaves. But what made her pause wasn't the design. It was the final sentence of the invitation. "We know you're busy, but if you can join us, please bring a dessert, nothing fancy." The word join was in quotation marks. She read it over and over, not because it was confusing, but because it was too clear. It felt like they wanted to say, "You're not really one of us," but we don't have the guts to say it outright. Julia turned off her screen and leaned back in her chair. Outside, the sky had started to darken. She thought about last year, when she didn't show up, and no one even asked why. This year she would go, not for the pie, not for them, but because it was time for a closure on her terms. Melissa's house hadn't changed. High ceilings, heavy white drapes, a crystal chandelier that sparkled as if every meal were a photo shoot for an interior design magazine. A uniformed server moved silently through the room. Soft jazz drifted from speakers hidden in the walls. But the air, it was always thick like the smiles of everyone here, polished polite, and so cold it could freeze you from the inside out. Julia stepped in, holding a tray of warm cinnamon apple pie she had baked that morning. She didn't choose it because it was easy. She chose it because it was the one thing her mother taught her to make when she was 12. Every fall, without saying, "I love you," her mother would quietly lay out the ingredients on the kitchen counter. A silent way of saying, "You're still on my mind." Julia placed her pie among the store-bought delicacies: chocolate mousse, imported almond tarts, panna cotta in glass cups. Then a whisper behind her, low, sharp, and just close enough to hear, still trying to look like she's wife material: "Anyone eating that pie's bound to be single forever." Julia turned her head. It was Vanessa Peters' ex-wife, the same woman who once borrowed money from Julia to open a nail salon, then vanished with a personal trainer. Julia didn't respond. She simply walked to the drinks table, poured herself a glass of chilled water, and drank. The cold slid down her throat like something too familiar, the taste of swallowing the truth again, quietly, without a fight. After the main course, as the sound of silverware began to fade, and the wine glasses were being topped off again, Julia thought the worst part was over. She quietly folded napkins, her eyes following little Luca, her nephew, laughing at a stuffed cat someone had given him. But then Melissa stood up. Her deep red satin dress clung to her slim figure, the chandelier light catching her cheekbones like she was stepping onto a stage. Ting, a soft chime echoed as she tapped her champagne glass. The room fell silent. Melissa smiled. The smile of someone who knew absolutely that she was in control. "Before we enjoy dessert," she began, voice light as air, but sharp as a blade, "my family has a little announcement to make. We've had a few private discussions, and we've taken a vote." Julia heard every word. A vote, voting on what her chest tightened. Every instinct in her began to brace. Melissa went on, her gaze fixed directly on Julia. "We meaning myself. Mark and Peter have agreed that Julia is no longer considered an official member of this family. silence, then a few awkward laughs. Her mother took a sip of wine and gave a soft chuckle, like someone had just told a joke in poor taste. Her father didn't look up. He just stared into his glass. As if he looked hard enough, he could will this moment out of existence. Julia didn't speak. She couldn't. She felt 8 years old again, left behind on the schoolyard after dark, because she forgot what time class ended, and no one came looking. The air in the dining room had thickened, like someone had poured wet cement right in the middle of the table. Melissa was still standing glass in hand, but the excitement had vanished from her eyes. Her voice rang clear. Each word sharp enough to cut without ever needing to raise her tone. Julia no longer engages with the family. She doesn't participate in the group chat, doesn't send pictures, doesn't check in, doesn't share her personal life. She chooses to be alone, which isn't wrong. But it means she's no longer part of the connection this family has always valued. Julia sat still. Her hands rested in her lap, her palms slowly turning cold and damp. Melissa glanced toward their mother, like she was seeking silent approval. Then she went on, and, while everyone contributes to the family fund for holidays, birthdays, events, Julia has never sent a single dime. Yet we still plan for her gifts, her meals, as if she were a guest. There was the soft clink of a spoon against a glass. No more awkward chuckles. No one looked at Julia anymore. You have no family of your own, no husband, no children. That doesn't make you less than, but it does make things harder to align. You live differently. You chose differently. Julia lifted her head. Her eyes weren't red. She wasn't angry. She was just cold. Who suggested the vote? Peter, her younger brother. The same boy who used to sleep beside her when they were kids. Who once cried through the night from a fever, and she stayed up to watch over him. Now he just shrugged, smirked slightly, as if this were just some class reunion with a show of hands. It started with Mom, he said casually. Julia nodded, not with rage, not with shock. Just a nod that confirmed what she'd always known but never fully let herself believe. She asked nothing more, but the memories surged back like a flood. The time she paid every cent of their father's hospital bill after his stroke. No one mentioned it again. The time Melissa used Julia's name to open a credit account to build her own brand, then defaulted. The family said, "It's just what family does, help each other." The time Julia lost her job after taking the fall for a co-worker's lawsuit. Her mother had said, "You're just too soft." They had taken the vote long ago. Today, they just finally said it out loud. Julia stood up slowly, as if the weight of the entire room had just been poured onto her shoulders. The chair scraped against the floor, a sound soft but sharp enough to slice through the thick silence. She said nothing, just reached behind her for the coat hanging on her chair. Her hand trembled slightly. Some wounds don't need tears because the pain has been there so long it's gone numb, eating away quietly at the heart layer by layer. She turned to leave, but then from the far end of the table a voice spoke up. Young, clear, unshaken. "I didn't vote." The whole room froze. All eyes turned to Lily, 19 years old, Melissa's daughter, still seated in the far corner, wearing a simple floral dress and a gaze that didn't flinch. She stood, placed her napkin gently on the table. Her voice did not waver. You can remove her from the group chat. You can take her name off the invites, off the family photos. But she's the only one who came to pick me up in the middle of the night when I was jumped at school. And you, Mom, you were at the spa. No one answered. The ones who'd been laughing minutes earlier now stared into their wine glasses, empty plates, or dimmed phone screens. Even Lily's father slid his chair back slightly, as if to distance himself from the collision. Lily looked at Julia. Her eyes were red, but no tears fell. Aunt Julia is the only one who's ever said something was wrong in this family. The only one who didn't pretend. Melissa leaned toward her husband, trying to keep her expression calm, but her voice dropped urgent and clipped. She's been poisoned. Julia looked at the girl. She didn't smile, didn't step forward for a hug. She just looked with eyes soft and full of gratitude, as if in a room full of people clapping for one another to drown out the emptiness. One voice still knew what was real and what wasn't, and then she walked out, this time with her head held high. That night, Julia returned to her small third-floor apartment, where the soft glow of warm yellow light washed over the worn wooden floors, and silence remained her most faithful companion. She didn't turn on the lights, just slipped off her shoes, hung her coat on the hook, and walked into the bedroom, where a small box lay in the drawer, wrapped in silver paper with a green emerald ribbon. She had bought it 2 months ago after overhearing her mother mention to a friend on the phone, "I've always loved French silk scarves, especially that emerald green. But I'm too old now. It'd just look silly on me." Julia remembered that. She always did, every time. For years she'd memorized her mother's preferences, the dishes she liked, the small habits. But somehow it had never been enough. She placed the box gently on the bed, sat beside it. Her fingers hovered over the wrapping, hesitating as if the gift inside held a final answer. Then slowly, she untied the ribbon, carefully, like undressing a bride who'd been left at the altar. The silk scarf was smooth and delicate, a shade of green that shimmered like deep lake water at dusk. She opened the drawer and pulled out a small piece of paper. She wrote, "I'm sorry for thinking that love shouldn't need a vote. No long explanations, no credit taken, no blame laid. Just an acknowledgement." Julia folded the scarf, tucked the note inside the box, wrapped it back in the original paper, taped it shut, and wrote her mother's address on the express shipping envelope. The next morning she stood in line at the post office. The Oregon air was cool. Misty rain gathered on her coat shoulders. The clerk asked if she wanted to include a message. She shook her head. No need. The package was no longer a birthday gift, not a gesture of hope, just a quiet repayment for the invisible debt of believing that if you tried hard enough, loved hard enough, endured long enough, you'd finally be enough. Her mother had once said, the only time Julia ever dared to stand up to Melissa, "I don't need your gifts. I need you to be more like your sister." That sentence had silenced Julia for months, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. On the way home, she stopped by the little cafe on the corner. She ordered a latte like always. The barista asked if she wanted whipped cream. She nodded. "I think today, I deserve a little sweetness." For the first time in years, those words weren't for anyone else, only for her. A week after the Thanksgiving dinner, Julia was wiping down her kitchen counter when her phone buzzed. A message from an old friend, just a Facebook link. No caption, no emoji, only a short note. "You should see this." Melissa's post was at the top of the page. A family photo from the dinner, everyone smiling around the lavish table. But the caption below made Julia stop cold. "Our family had a rough week. Everyone from the grandparents to the little ones had stomach pain, vomiting, and diarrhea after dinner. We suspect the issue may have come from dessert. We're not blaming anyone, just reminding folks to be cautious with homemade food, especially when you're not sure whose hands made it." Dozens of comments followed, mostly from old acquaintances and Melissa's friends. "Oh my God, who brought that dish? That apple pie looked nice. But yeah, homemade's always risky. Was someone trying to make a statement? I heard Julia brought the pie. Right, Julia set the phone down. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. All she felt was a hollowness spreading through her chest, the kind of emptiness that comes when you're no longer surprised, no longer hurt, just confirmed. 2 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon while she was teaching, the school receptionist called her to the front office. A plainclothes man was waiting. He showed a badge. Local investigator. We received an anonymous report. There's an allegation that Julia Evans brought contaminated food to a family event, causing multiple cases of food poisoning. Julia looked him in the eye. No flinch. I brought 1 tray of apple pie. Didn't force anyone to eat it. If no one touched it, that's fine too. I couldn't afford anything but flour, apples, and cinnamon anyway. Her voice wasn't angry, wasn't weak, just tired. The investigator asked to check her kitchen, her baking process, her grocery receipts. Julia opened the fridge, handed over the leftover pie neatly stored in a plastic container. Everything was clean. Everything made sense. But no one cares about the truth when a lie has already done its damage. 3 days later, they came back. With video footage from a doorbell camera, Julia had forgotten she'd even installed footage from the moment she brought the pie into Melissa's house. The grainy video showed it clearly. Melissa lifted the cover of Julia's pie, frowned, then turned to her housekeeper and whispered, "Take this to the downstairs kitchen. Swap it with the pie from French oak. Homemade looks ugly. It won't photograph well." The housekeeper nodded, carried the tray away. Moments later, a different pie appeared on the table, glossy, pristine, topped with powdered sugar. When the officers returned to close the matter, they didn't apologize. They didn't admit fault. "Thank you for your cooperation," they said. "The report has been verified. The case is closed. No calls from the family, no messages, no explanations." Julia sat in the kitchen after they left, holding her old ceramic mug, eyes fixed on the window. Rain still tapped gently against the sill. She didn't need an apology. She just needed them to know, if you want to cut someone out of a family, at least have the decency to do it honestly. Not through accusations, not through poison, not through lies, right up to the final moment. She poured hot water into her cup, dropped in a cinnamon tea bag. The scent rose, warm, sharp, unmistakable. It didn't need anyone to confirm it. It was real, just like her, still whole, still standing. On Saturday morning, Julia was watering the lavender pot by her window when the landline rang. She almost didn't pick up, thinking it was another robocall. But then, a calm, low female voice came through the line. "Hello, Ms. Julia Evans. I'm a nurse at Maplewood Retirement Home. There's a gentleman named Howard who asked me to call. He said you're the only person he wants to speak to right now." Julia paused. The name Howard carried the scent of old summers. An old neighbor, the man who used to sit on her parents' porch every evening, drinking black tea and fixing leaks for free. Since he'd moved to the home, she hadn't heard anything. Howard's voice came on, frail, a little raspy, but laced with humor. "Still breathing, are you? I was about to wait for you at the cemetery, but you took your sweet time." Julia laughed softly, though her heart tightened in her chest. "What made you call me Mr. Howard? I heard about your family's Thanksgiving. Word travels, even here. But I'm not calling for gossip. I wanted to tell you something because I think you need to know." His voice slowed. Not dramatic, just sad. Cold, in a way that felt honest. "Last year, right after I moved in, your father, Donald, came by. Not to see me. He showed up 3 times. Always at odd hours when no one was paying attention. He'd sit in the corner of the rec room, silent, never spoke to anyone. The last time he asked me not to tell a soul. But I don't think he needs that secret kept anymore." Julia gripped the phone, her palm damp with sweat. He said, "I wasn't a good father. But Julia, She's the only one who came back. He told me you were the one who paid his hospital bills, the one who brought a new sweater when he was in the ICU, the one who never asked where your mother had gone, just quietly stayed and cared. And then he cried, Julia. A man like that, he cried like a child. He said, she doesn't know it, but I still think of her as my daughter. Julia couldn't speak. She sat in her kitchen. The tea on the table still steamed, but her hands were ice cold. Howard's voice softened. I can't fix what he broke, but I can hand you the one thing he left behind, the truth. The silence stretched, a thin wire pulled tight between two aging souls, one already gone, the other holding sorrow for him. Your mother never visited him, Howard added. Not once. Julia set the phone down after whispering a thank you barely audible. She didn't cry, didn't scream, but something inside her, a small part that still held hope, that someone had known, had understood, had tried, died quietly in that moment. And then she understood. It wasn't just her who'd been voted out of the family. There were others. Men and women who were quietly pushed out, not with words, but with absence. With no seat saved at the table. But just like her, they still came back. Not because they were welcomed, but because they had never wanted to leave. On Sunday afternoon, Julia pulled down the old box from the attic, a faded cardboard box with bent corners. One that had followed her through 3 moves and a life no one had ever really asked about. She was looking for a few photos to send Lily, her niece who had just texted, "Do you have any pictures of you as a kid? I want to know who you were." Before everyone said you were different. Most of the old photos were of others, family portraits, Melissa's graduation, Peter's wedding, her father standing proudly next to a new car. In almost all of them, Julia was just a face in the corner. But then, at the bottom of the box, she found one photo face down. It was faded with time. Julia, age 10, standing in front of a simple birthday cake on the kitchen table. A few flickering candles. Her smile shy, hesitant. No balloons, no friends. Just her father seated beside her, her mother cutting the cake. Her eyes turned away. On the back of the photo was a crooked line of handwriting, slanted and messy. It was clearly her father's. She asked why only Mom and Dad were at her birthday. Her mother said, "She hasn't learned how to be loved." Julia sank to the floor, her fingers trembling as they clutched the photo. The tears came not because of those words, but because for the first time she knew her father had seen it. He heard it. He knew. But he never did anything. Her mother had always said, whenever Julia pushed back, whenever she cried or refused to smile, "You're too sensitive. You need to learn how to let people love you." No one can love someone who makes them tired all the time. And back then, Julia believed her. She thought something was wrong with her. She learned to hush, to smile politely, to avoid conflict. She became the easy child, the quiet one, the invisible one. Now, reading those words on the back of the photo, she understood. Her mother didn't hate her because she was wrong. Her mother hated her because she was a mirror, a reflection of something she couldn't control. A daughter who wasn't Melissa, who showed her feelings, who refused to be perfect. And her father, the one who loved silently, chose silence, like every man in that house. But Julia, she would be silent no longer. Not after today. Not after everything. That Christmas, Julia didn't hang lights in the window. She didn't put up a tree. She didn't play carols. But her kitchen was warm from dawn. The scent of apple, cinnamon, and melting butter filled the small apartment, soaking into her sweater, into the curtains, into her bones. One by one, 4 children knocked on her door from our students, kids who'd been expelled for unpaid fees, who had no parents to sign their report cards. Julia welcomed them in, handed each a small apron, old, but clean. She taught them how to knead dough peel apples, mix cinnamon. And she listened patiently as one of them shared what it felt like to sleep at a bus station. The oven grew hot, and her chest did too, a quiet kind of warmth she hadn't felt in years. No banquet hall, no holiday party, just a room full of people who'd never had a door opened for them before. Before leaving, each child received a small apple pie, wrapped in parchment paper, with a handwritten note inside. No one is ever truly abandoned unless we let it happen. Late that night, as Julia washed the final baking tray, the doorbell rang. It was Lily. She didn't say a word, just stepped forward and hugged Julia from behind, tightly. "I left the family group chat," she whispered. Julia turned to face her, not surprised, just nodded. "You don't need to vote, Lily. You just have to choose the right people." She finally understood why her mother never loved her. It wasn't because she was difficult. It was because she couldn't pretend. And in a family that worshipped appearances, a child who told the truth was the one sin most hard to forgive. And in that tiny kitchen with flour still on the counter, Julia made the choice her mother never did, to leave no one behind. Not even herself.